Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us again here on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. We have another early spring habitat condition report for you, this time from Saskatchewan. Joining me on the phone to deliver that update is Kelly Rempel, Head of Habitat Asset Management, Saskatchewan Provincial Operations for Ducks Unlimited Canada. Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Tell our listeners just a bit about yourself, where you are, what you do for Ducks Unlimited Canada.
Well, I'm located in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. That's in west central part of Saskatchewan. As the head of habitat asset management for the province, my team looks after all of our vast inventory of wetland conservation projects. So basically my group that I'm responsible for manages projects from the U.S. border to the forest and from Alberta to Manitoba. So the entire province of Saskatchewan where Ducks Unlimited has projects. And I've been working with Ducks Unlimited. I'm going into my 31st year.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So you have been around the province many, many times. Are you a native of Saskatchewan?
Yeah, born and raised, yeah.
Okay. Well, you are exactly the right person that we need to speak with. You and I have never met, so I really appreciate you joining us here. So yeah, that's fantastic. You're definitely the right guy. Have you been able to get out on the landscape much already this spring?
Yeah, it's in my position, I don't get out in the field as much as I used to, but with all the social distancing and everything people are going through now, my weekends I've been getting out a lot, just as lots of people, just to get out of the house from the home office. And but I get very good updates and lots of photos from my staff that are all over Saskatchewan. So I got a pretty good virtual way of knowing what the conditions are like. But I have gotten out a lot myself this spring as well.
You touched on my next question. I was going to ask you how many staff you have across the province there to help you with this kind of this virtual view of habitat conditions. How many people are we looking at that you connect with?
Well, I have 10 direct reports that do that, but we have I don't know what we have for complete field staff, but we'd have probably pushing 35 or 40 total field staff, but 10 of those are on my team. And basically, I look after projects from one end to the other. So I get a pretty good feel for where the conditions are good or poor or what the runoff was like this spring. So.
Okay. Well, let's get on into the habitat update, as we will talk about many, many times. Spring habitat conditions are some of the most important aspects of the breeding conditions for waterfowl. They don't necessarily determine the final outcome, as we have talked about in the past, and certainly they do not. They are not the sole predictor of hunter success, either in Canada or in the States. There are a lot of other things that have to line up with respect to hunting success. So this is just the very first ingredient, or perhaps the second ingredient, if we think about the size of the returning duck population as the first ingredient. The second ingredient would be the habitat that's there for them when they return, the condition of that habitat when they return. And then there are a whole other sequence of events that take place throughout the rest of the summer and fall before birds start migrating south and people get to enjoy that resource. So Saskatchewan is if I remember this correctly, its motto is the land of the living skies. It truly lives up to that motto. And it is just one of the most important areas, or I don't even think we have to say one of. It is the most important area within the prairie pothole region for duck production. It's the key part of that duck factory. Is that a fair assessment, Kelly, the way you see it?
Yeah. Actually, you could go one step further and say it's the key jurisdiction in all of North America, really. But
yeah, you're exactly right.
There's prairie potholes for sure. But I mean, the prairie pothole region itself is the duck factory for North America, and Saskatchewan, as a province, has generally on most years has more breeding pairs than most other jurisdictions. So
good point. Well, let's talk about what you're seeing with respect to habitat conditions. How were we as we came out of the winter, and how are habitat conditions, pond wetland conditions shaping up this spring for the ducks?
Well, it's kind of a tale of two stories. I mean, Saskatchewan's a pretty big province, so we really have, though, even probably a more drastic split than normal. Our southern regions, from roughly speaking, if you took a line straight across from Saskatoon across the province, for everywhere from there south is having had very little snowfall this winter, and subsequently had very little runoff, and already had fairly dry conditions. So the conditions in southern Saskatchewan are below normal. There's pockets that caught some smaller snow events and had some runoff. So there's areas that are better than others, but for the most part, everything south of that line from Saskatoon south is below normal, and some areas are fair to poor, and some would be a little better than that. But the better news story is everything from Saskatoon north had better moisture conditions in the fall and received very good snowfall, especially late snowfall. We actually had a late spring, so winter extended, and we had a lot of very good snowfall events, and so runoff was actually pretty good. Probably closer to average, but because we had a fairly a fast warming, it went from being cold to being real warm. So we capitalized on the moisture that was out there, and wetland conditions are pretty good. I mean, some areas you could probably describe as good to excellent, even if they had a little more snowfall. But things are sort of the central, what we would call the central parklands and up into the forest fringe are really good conditions, and should have a really good strong breeding effort, versus the southern prairies will have more spotty conditions with probably some areas with poor production and some with fair to good. So
I want to go back to a couple of things that you mentioned. One is with respect to sort of the way the habitats break down there across Saskatchewan as you draw that line across, roughly equal to where Saskatoon is. And you kind of alluded to this. I just want to make sure we paint a clear picture. As we get north of there, we transition pretty quickly out of the intensively farmed, cultivated area into that parkland, prairie parkland region, which is more forested, and then eventually it transitioned into the Boreal Forest. But then, south of Saskatoon is where it's intensive agriculture, and it's a historical prairie. And typically, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but typically when conditions are good in that prairie region, productivity is better. Birds can be more productive. But then north of there into the parklands, in the Boreal Forest, although the conditions are more stable, less variable from year to year, the productivity overall seems to be a little bit lower. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. Is that hold true?
What we would call the prairie parkland, and then up into the forest fringe, generally has a lower nest success. So you need a lot more birds on, but the saving grace is that it tends to not be as drought prone. So the part of the reason there is trees is because it does have more moisture, and part of the reason that the prairies are what they are is because they have these drought frequencies. And we're just basically in the prairie ecozones. We're just in not a full drought, it's not like you go down there and not see any wetlands and any breeding ducks. I mean, it's not that bad. I mean, over my 30 years, I've seen that multiple times where you can hardly find a wetland in southern Saskatchewan. So it's certainly not that this year. There was a bit of carryover from what we call carryover, so water that's stayed in ponds over the last couple of years where we have better precipitation conditions. So there's still a lot of wetlands that, even though we didn't get much runoff, are still holding plenty of water to attract some breeding ducks too. So it's not a full out dust bowl kind of a spring or something, but it's just not a great spring.
Sounds like we have decent conditions up in the parklands and Boreal Forest, and it gets drier, somewhat similar to last year as Scott Stevens described it. Is that kind of the similar characterization in Saskatchewan that it looks a lot like it did last year?
Yeah, I would actually just take it a step further and say it's probably even slightly drier in the south and slightly wetter in the north. So, or not the north, but the central. So you almost have more a more drastic difference even this year than last year. So.
Now, what about the Allen Hills region that's just east and southeast of Saskatoon? I know that's an area of exceptionally high wetland density. I've actually done some of my master's research was conducted in Allen Hills. I know Ducks Unlimited Canada has some major habitat investments in that particular area. How is it shaping up in terms of water conditions?
Well, it did have very little snow, so runoff was what I would have to call poor or fair to poor at best, but there was actually pretty good carryover in the Allen Hills. It's had really good water the last 5 years, and a lot of that carryover on those ponds. Your semi-permanents are in pretty decent shape because of carryover, because of course they're the ones that hold, water that freezes over the winter and basically thaws, and you don't need much, or you don't need necessarily any runoff to attract birds to those ponds if they're carried over from the fall. So there was good carryover. I'm getting reports of really good numbers of canvasbacks. Of course, that makes sense if the prairies are dry. So where you do have semi-permanent wetlands where, divers are more attracted to those kind of wetlands with emergent vegetation and whatnot. And even my guys down there are even saying there was a few temporary or seasonal wetlands that did have just enough snow to fill up enough to attract some birds. So it's definitely the degree of the dryness kind of goes south towards the North Dakota-Montana border. So it's a little better south of Saskatoon. And then as you get south of Regina, it gets worse. So it's basically, even though I said it's a pretty drastic line, it's still gradiently kind of drier as you go south. So.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Any other notable observations with respect to duck numbers? I do, knowing that the Dakotas are going to be exceptionally wet. I'm not sure about Montana yet. I need to get on the phone with somebody about that. But I imagine a lot of the prairie nesting species are going to be stopped in North Dakota and South Dakota to take advantage of the exceptional conditions there. So we'll probably, if we had the breeding population survey, we'd probably see this larger number of ducks south of the border and fewer number of ducks north of the border, at least proportionally speaking.
Yep.
But any noteworthy observations with respect to duck numbers or species distributions for the province?
Well, I think as far as anecdotally seeing more higher numbers, it seems to be the divers that we're seeing. But of course, the big loser species when you have dry on the grassland prairies here is pintails, and they don't tend to just pop up into the parklands or boreal fringe. Unfortunately, if they don't have conditions on the shortgrass prairie kind of habitat, then they oftentimes will take off all the way to Alaska or maybe try to skip over to Alberta or something like that. So the species that seem like we're seeing more of, I mean, not that anybody's probably, I'm going to really take a species nobody probably cares I'm saying anything about, but there has been a lot of staff saying, wow, the coots are back this year, which last year was some kind, yeah, I know. It's like, all right, there's coots. But it was weird because last year, all you heard was people in Saskatchewan saying, where are the coots? And so something interesting happening there where people are seeing lots of coots, including just my own anecdotal cruising around a lot of marshes and all of a sudden going, man, they are back. So I don't know I don't have an answer for that. But yeah, and as far as migration goes, it was late because I mentioned we had a late winter. So birds were back late. Arctic geese only left here. There's still a few trickles of snow geese and white fronts around, but they really kind of bust out here last weekend and last week, I guess. There's a lot of, which is about normal, I guess. So I guess really the Arctic geese just staged on at least the Saskatchewan prairie a little shorter time because they showed up late, but still left about their normal time to head up to the Arctic.
I wanted to go into that a little bit. I didn't even give much advanced thought to talking about geese, but I'm glad you brought that up, because the annual studies of Arctic goose colonies is another thing that has basically been halted as a result of the COVID-19 situations. Those camps that have been annually occupied for 30 or 50 years. When you look across the Arctic and subarctic, there are no researchers there this year to measure productivity, to look at the size of the colonies, to estimate the size of the number of breeders in those colonies, and so that's, that too is a pretty big gap. But we can probably try to draw some inferences based on some of the timings that you're talking about here. But so it sounds like they got held up by some cold weather and maybe arrived on the prairies a bit later. But then things, I guess, weather conditions improved, moderated, and then they were actually able to leave and head north around the same time they normally do. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Like usually around that 15th to the 25th is when all our Arctic geese, they usually come and they stage. This is their last agriculture staging area. So they bulk up on waste grain here until the very latest, or, that they can before they head to the Arctic to nest. And numbers were strong. I mean, it seemed like as far as snow goose numbers were strong. White front numbers. I'm in the western side of Saskatchewan, so we have a lot of white fronts and Ross's geese as well here. And yeah, numbers seem strong. And didn't know if I guess not knowing what the conditions are up in the Arctic as far as spring thaw goes, it's always a mystery to us down here as to when they all of a sudden hit the switch and go. But it really seemed like last weekend you heard them going all night.
At least they weren't delayed getting out of the prairies. If they were delayed getting out of the prairies, that might have foreshadowed lower productivity, because those birds don't have very much time to pull off a clutch of eggs, raise their broods once they get to the Arctic. So any kind of pinch on that window is really going to hurt them. So at least they got out of the prairies, it sounds like, on a normal time frame. So we'll have to catch up with some of our other researchers that have studied snow geese for many, many years and see what kind of remote assessment of kind of snow conditions and spring thaw conditions they're able to do. I know with all sorts of satellites and sensors that we have circling above us now, there probably will be some opportunities to look at those data and see what we can, ascertain with respect to conditions, lacking people actually being on the ground. Now, we obviously won't be able to enumerate the number of adults and juveniles from some of the late summer banding. I think those might have already been called off. So we'll have a bit of a blind spot there this year. But again, from a population sustainability standpoint, we're not at all worried about that from the lack of data. It's just people look forward with anticipation to some of these numbers on productivity that are coming out of some of these breeding studies, and we won't have those this year. But we'll see what kind of inferences we can draw just based on remote assessments of habitat. And so that gives me something else to think about with respect to reaching out to other people. So appreciate that. Now, I also did want to go back. We're gonna wrap this up here in just a minute. I've taken up enough of your time. You've given us plenty of great information, Kelly. But I did want to go back briefly and touch on coots. You mentioned, obviously, for everyone, we realize coots are not a member of the ducks, geese, or swans. They're actually a member of the rail family. We get that. But you did mention at the outset that that's a species that probably no one would be interested in. But I will happily relay that information to Dr. Scott Yake, former chief scientist with Ducks Unlimited. I think there's a rumor that he has a soft spot for coots, so I'll relay that information to him. And that's always an interesting way to find out who actually listens to the podcast, because if he listens to the podcast, I imagine he'll send me a nastygram email here in a few weeks. So it's just a bit of a test.
Yep.
But no, that's interesting. So it is a species that not a lot of people pay attention to, but it uses many of the same wetlands uses the same wetlands that waterfowl do, for sure.
Yeah, and they are a real obvious indicator. Like even people who don't pay that much attention to species breakdown, everything else, they'll still say to you, "Man, there's lots of coots this year," or "Man, there's no coots." Like they're either here or they're not, and this year they seem to be here, and last year they really weren't. So it's just an interesting I don't have a lot of rationale for why that is, but it's just one of those things that, like we say, we either see them in big numbers or we don't some years. And this year we're seeing them.
Yeah, Dr. Todd Arnold. Now, if he listens to this, he would get on me for not mentioning him. He actually does have a real true soft spot for coots. He studied them as one of his graduate programs. I'm not sure if it was his master's or his PhD, but he finds them fascinating from an ecological study, evolutionary ecology perspective. So a shout out to you, Todd, if you're listening to this. But anyway, we'll move on from coots now. That's been fun. And Kelly, any final comments? I think as we would summarize here, reasonably dry in the prairies south of Saskatoon, better conditions north of there, similar, maybe a bit drier than what we saw in Saskatchewan last year. As Scott Stevens mentioned on a previous episode, things can change rapidly if we get a big burst of rain across the landscape. Now, I don't know what you're seeing in terms of forecast, but things can change, and certainly late precipitation into late spring, early summer can boost productivity for some of those later nesting species. So the conditions in the early spring are not the end-all be-all for what the ducks are going to find and be able to take advantage of, but it's certainly one of the early ingredients. So, any other comments, Kelly, that you wanted to leave us with?
Well, no, I'll just expand on that. What you said is we're actually forecast for at least the central and more into the northern parts of Saskatchewan. We are forecast for a 2-day rain here that could bring an inch or more. And if we get an inch of rain, that actually does fill up ephemeral wetlands and even temporary wetlands, which, is the early nesting species will be on nests now, but lots of your teal and later nesting won't even be on nests yet. So that'll provide new habitat. Or if mallards are re-nesting and you got new temporaries pop up because of rain, for sure it can add productivity. So hopeful the forecast is good because our forecast holds true because we're supposed to get a pretty good 2-day rain here. So
very good. That is some good news. All right. Well, I'm not sure if this will air by the time that actually happens, but anyway, we'll catch up with you sometime later in the season. So kind of keep your eyes peeled. I know you will, just in general, having a good feel for habitat conditions and how they transpire through the summer. We'll catch up with you later on if you're willing to do that. And again, thank you, Kelly, for taking your time to join us. Thank you for the work that you do on the prairies and the work that all of your staff do on the prairies. It's been great talking with you.
No, it's been great talking to you. Thanks.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Kelly Rempel of Ducks Unlimited Canada. He gave us a great report on the state of habitat conditions, early spring habitat conditions in Saskatchewan. And so we all look forward with anticipation to future reports and how the rest of the spring and summer shape up for waterfowl populations. We also thank our producer, Clay Baird, who does a great job getting these podcasts edited and out to you, our listeners. And of course, our listeners, we appreciate you, your time. We appreciate you spending that time with us. And most importantly, we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.